Hey guys, I'm Redeemed Zoomer, and today we are making a tier list ranking the various arguments for Roman Catholicism. The inspiration for this video comes from my good friend Austin, who runs the YouTube channel Gospel Simplicity. Really awesome channel, you should check it out. Link will be in the description. So I'm making this video because although I've always been Presbyterian as long as I've been Christian, almost 8 years now, I've always been very familiar with Catholicism. I'm an Italian who grew up in New York. I mean, I'm only a quarter Italian, but come on, everyone who's from New York is honorary Italian. New York is more Italian than Italy. I have a lot of extended family who are Catholic to some degree, and my mom is a very devout Catholic. And even though I became Protestant, I considered Catholicism when I was first becoming Christian, and later when I was first figuring out what the Presbyterian Church believes. And although I never decided to become Catholic, I've always really respected Catholicism. And I've always had a lot of exposure to it. I remember in high school many years ago when I was figuring out how to navigate my faith in a very atheist New York public high school, I would watch tons of Father Mike Schmitz and Bishop Robert Barron and Father Casey, and I learned a lot from them. So I've always really respected Roman Catholicism. I think a lot of people who were not exposed to Catholicism, who were raised in, the Bible Belt, and they were taught Catholics were all a bunch of evil Pope worshippers, when they're first exposed to Catholicism, they're like, what? Catholics don't worship Mary and earn their salvation? Psh! Why didn't my Baptist pastor tell me that? But I've always had exposure to it, and I've always respected it. 3 years ago, when everyone on the internet was Reformed Baptist, they told me to stop associating with Catholics because they deny the gospel. And now a lot of those people have become Roman Catholic and are telling me to submit to Rome, and I still believe the same things I did back then. So let's get right into it. Let's get into the various arguments for Catholicism. I'm going to rank them a bit differently than Austin did, but, different arguments work more or less on different people. I'll explain why. Okay, so the first argument is apostolic succession. I'm going to put this in D tier. Apostolic succession means that a valid church must have succession going back to the apostles. A valid church must be under the authority of a bishop who is ordained by another bishop, who's ordained by another bishop, all the way going back to the apostles, who can trace their lineage back to the apostles. There's several problems with using this as an argument for Roman Catholicism in particular. The first thing is that multiple denominations can claim to have apostolic succession if you define apostolic succession as a physical chain of bishops, which not everybody does. It's not just the Catholic Church, it's the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Oriental Orthodox Church, and the Assyrian Church of the East, and a lot of the Anglican churches, and some of the Lutheran churches. So apostolic succession might rule out certain things, but it doesn't prove Catholicism. It just maybe narrows down the options a little bit. But not everyone who believes in apostolic succession believes it has to be purely through bishops, because the whole Presbyterian argument is that in the early church, elder was identical to bishop. And most Protestant denominations have apostolic succession through elders, like Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans, even a lot of Congregationalists and Baptists have presbyterial succession, which is apostolic succession through elders. And there's arguments about what apostolic succession actually meant in the early church. There's debate over whether it was like a physical chain of bishops or whether it was about the succession of apostolic teaching, which normatively happens through a physical succession of bishops. So I don't think that's a very good argument for Roman Catholicism in particular. I think there's better arguments than that. But if you were raised in a church where it's like Billy Bob's non-denominational church, that clearly doesn't have succession to anything. So anything that seems a bit more historic than that is going to convince you. But I didn't grow up in Billy Bob's non-denominational strip mall Burger King Bible church. Alright, so the next argument is the argument for authority, and I think this is an A-tier argument, especially in our day and age, because in our day and age, there's so much political turmoil, and due to the internet, there are so many competing ideologies, and nobody knows what to believe. Now, more than any other denomination, Catholicism is centered around authority. If there's a theme for each denomination, I would say for Presbyterians it's the sovereignty of God, for Lutherans it's the gospel, for the Eastern Orthodox it's tradition. But for Catholics I think it would be authority, the authority of the church. That can be a nice solid rock for people who are struggling to find out what to believe in this day and age. I think during the time of the Reformation, this was almost a reason to not be Catholic because it was seen as a tyranny. There was a lot of politics involved during the Reformation. A lot of people saw the Pope as this political tyrant and just couldn't wait to get away from him. But nowadays, now that there's so much chaos, now that the government is so secular, and the whole Western world is so secular, people are desperate for some solid rock of authority that doesn't change with political trends. And even though I've always been Protestant, I've always respected the Catholic Church's opinion on political issues, because I notice because they're this international organization, they're not necessarily swayed by the politics of our time. Some people would say, in some sense, they have been. Like, you could make the argument that Pope Francis is a bit politically liberal, and that Vatican II was a concession to some modernist political ideas, but they're not nearly as swayed by politics as either the Protestants or, honestly, the Eastern Orthodox churches with the whole nationalistic conflicts going on right now. So I think the authority argument is a fairly good argument for Catholicism. So in C tier, we have Eucharistic miracles. Now, with all miracles, whether you believe them depends on how skeptical you are about miracles in general. So people who deny all Eucharistic miracles, people who have a very skeptical mindset, there's not much you can do about that. But people who are willing to believe miracles with enough evidence, they might believe the Eucharistic miracles of the Catholic Church, but many other denominations also have miracles. There's many miracles in the Eastern Orthodox Church. There's many miracles in the Oriental Orthodox churches. I recently made a video about miracles in every denomination. There's Baptist miracles. There's miracles of people being miraculously healed once they were baptized in the way that Baptists specifically say you must be baptized. So I think Eucharistic miracles are an argument that Catholicism is a true church, but it doesn't prove that it's the true church. It doesn't prove any exclusivity whatsoever. So I think Eucharistic miracles can help you if you think Catholicism is a false church, and you need to be convinced that it's a true church, but I've always been convinced it's a true church, so that's not really that compelling to me. Alright, B tier is the Eliakim typology. So in the Old Testament, there's this guy, Eliakim, who's given the keys to the house of David, and whatever he binds shall be bound, whatever he looses shall be loosed. And that really parallels when Jesus gives the keys of the kingdom to Peter in the New Testament. And this argument is famously what convinced the former evangelical, non-denominational guy, Cameron Bertuzzi, who runs the YouTube channel Capturing Christianity. This is what convinced him. Now, this argument is not like an argument that Catholics during the Reformation really used. I think it's kind of like a niche, nerdy argument. But because it appeals to Scripture, and because as a Protestant I respect arguments that appeal to Scripture, I think it's decent. I would still contest it. I still don't think the parallels are strong enough. I still think you could argue just as easily that Jesus gave the keys to the whole church and not just to Peter or Peter and Peter's successors. But yeah. So F tier, this is our first F tier argument, is the argument for an infallible interpreter. Like, what good is an infallible Bible without an infallible interpreter? I recently made a video on why this is a really bad argument. Because if you need an infallible interpreter to interpret the infallible Bible, then you need another infallible interpreter to interpret that infallible interpreter. And that creates an infinite regress of, like, mathematical induction. It reminds me of kind of when Catholics say, like, oh, for Jesus to be without sin, Mary needs to be without sin. That creates mathematical induction, because then St. Anne, Mary's mother, needs to also be without sin. And that creates infinite mathematical regress. It's the same with, like, the whole canon argument. It's like, if you need an infallible list of infallible books, then that infallible list needs to be in another infallible category. So any argument that sort of causes you to need mathematical induction going to infinity is not a good argument. And I think this idea that a text is meaningless without an interpreter is very Kantian, very modernist, and if that's your framework, if you think everything needs to be interpreted, then the whole world turns to glass, and the only authority is you, because all interpretation, all chains of interpretation eventually terminate in you. So I think it's a pretty terrible argument, honestly. All right, next is the argument that Protestants are disunified. The 40,000 Protestant denominations, bro. First of all, that's BS. There aren't 40,000 Protestant denominations. Like, even if you count non-denominationals and, like, these Church of Christ or Seventh-day Adventists and Mormons as Protestant, which I don't, there still aren't 40,000 denominations. That same statistic that says there are 40,000 denominations from Gordon Conwell also says there's like 300 Catholic denominations, because they count the Catholic Church in each country as its own denomination. So it's a really ridiculous statistic. They also count each non-denominational church as its own denomination, which I actually agree with. That's why I'm against non-denominationalism, but I don't consider non-denominationals Protestant. Why? It's in the name non-denominational. It's like the Ben Shapiro meme. It's like, it's in the name Boy Scouts, right? So no, I do not consider non-denominationals Protestant. I define Protestants as the institutions that came from the Protestant Reformation, and right now there are only 7 mainstream institutions that came from the Protestant Reformation: Presbyterians, Lutherans, Anglicans, Methodists, Congregationalists, the Dutch Reformed, and Baptists. And in the mainline churches, they're all in communion with each other, and that makes up the vast majority of people who belong to those traditions. So there are, like, an endless chain of, like, smaller offshoots, but I'm not in the offshoots. I'm in mainline Protestantism. So mainline Protestantism really isn't that divided, especially because Protestants are willing to commune with each other across denominational boundaries. You could make the argument that Protestantism is actually more unified than ecclesialism, the whole one true church churches that can't take communion with each other, and they have damned each other historically. So I don't think that's a good argument at all. I think it is a good argument if you grew up in, like, evangelical chaos, but I've never been that. I've always been a mainline Protestant, so that doesn't really work on me. All right, so the first S-tier argument is the argument from personal experience. You might say, oh, that's a bad argument, it's subjective. Well, it's a very good argument for the person experiencing it, and it could be persuasive to other people, because we do rely on testimony. Think about it. Why did the disciples start believing in the gospel? Because they personally experienced Jesus rising from the dead. And their personal experience enabled them to persuade other people who didn't personally experience it to believe in it. It's like the standard apologetic for the resurrection is, well, these 12 apostles saw the resurrection, they went out and told everyone else. So I don't actually think personal experience is a very bad argument. And like a lot of people that are very close to me, I know that are Catholic or becoming Catholic, their main argument is personal experience of, usually it's of the Eucharist or something. Now, I know other people who would say the exact same thing for a different denomination, like Lutheranism or Eastern Orthodoxy, but if you didn't experience that, if you experienced that in Catholicism, then that's ultimately what you'll be guided to. And as a Calvinist, I do believe that everyone is ultimately guided to their conclusions by the Holy Spirit, and that our reasoning can sort of help us along. But for most people, whether they're Catholic or Presbyterian or Baptist or whatever, they decide what they believe based on personal experience and personal affections, and most of the reasoning is kind of post hoc to justify it. Because most of the Catholic converts I know, I want to say most, some of the Catholic converts I know, they first had a powerful experience of Christ in the Eucharist while still rationally disagreeing with Catholicism, and then after that, once they found this love and affection for Catholicism, they worked out all their differences later on. I do believe, as Augustine said, faith precedes reason. So this is not a dig. I think it's pretty valid to convert to something based on personal experience, depending on what the personal experience is. All right. Next up, we have the whole pretty churches argument. You've seen the memes like Catholic Church, beautiful cathedral, beautiful tourist attraction cathedral. Orthodox Church, beautiful tourist attraction cathedral. Protestant Church, random strip mall that was planted last year. It's just not true. Like, the reason it gets F tier is because it's straight up not true. Yeah, of course the Catholic Church has beautiful churches. The Protestant churches also have beautiful churches. Tons of beautiful Protestant churches all over America. If you go to the downtown area of any American town, you'll see like 5 beautiful historic mainline Protestant churches. So yeah, Catholics have beautiful churches. They're a true church. It's true Christianity. But so do Protestants. So again, that's an argument for why Catholicism is pretty cool, I guess. But we're not arguing why Catholicism is pretty true. We're ranking arguments for why Catholicism is the true church exclusively. And the fact that it has beautiful churches doesn't prove that, because a lot of other people do as well. All right. Anyway, next up we have the Marian apparitions, and this kind of falls in the same category as the Eucharistic miracles. Like, yeah, it's possible the Catholic Church has miracles. It's possible that these are some of the miracles the Catholic Church has, but other churches have miracles too. So that doesn't really prove exclusivity. A lot of these arguments that I'm ranking more low prove that the Catholic Church is cool, or the Catholic Church has cool things, or that the Catholic Church is a true church, but it doesn't prove exclusivity. And exclusivity is what Catholics need to prove. All right, so the next one is an A-tier argument because it actually is an exclusive argument, and that would be the size and universality, or rather the Catholicity, of the Catholic Church. Because according to Catholics, the Catholic Church is the real true church because all denominations profess belief in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. It's in the Nicene Creed. The word Catholic means universal. So it would make sense that the biggest church is the universal church. Now, I've heard some Catholics tell me this is a pretty bad argument. They tell me even if only like 2 people were still Catholic, it would still be the true church. Sure, but I actually do think it's pretty compelling to argue for the sheer size of Catholicism compared to the other denominations. The majority of Christians are Catholic. It's not a huge majority. It's like 50-something%. But that still says something, doesn't it? it's really hard to argue that the one true church is like a very tiny sect. And Jesus did say the gate is narrow, but the gate is still pretty narrow, even if you say Catholicism is the one true church, because it's still a minority of humans on earth. And even a lot of people within the Catholic Church, just like within all denominations, don't necessarily believe the teachings of that denomination or are not faithful members of that denomination, which applies all across the board. But I think that, if God really did choose to have one true church that is his representative on earth, it makes sense that that church would be the biggest and most powerful one. That just does make sense. So to me, the size of the Catholic Church actually is a decent argument. I guess the Protestant response would be, according to Protestant ecclesiology, according to a Protestant view of the church is even bigger than it is in Catholicism, because Protestant views of the church can include the Catholic Church, but also include the Eastern Orthodox Church, and include the Anglican Church, and the Lutheran Church, and the Presbyterian Church. So I think Protestants really have the biggest view of the church, because we include all the Nicene denominations. As Gavin Ortland said, Protestantism is more Catholic than Catholicism, because it has a more universal view of the church. All right, next up in D tier, we have the unanimous consensus of the Fathers. The Council of Trent, that's the main council that solidified Catholicism in opposition to Protestantism. They repeatedly appeal to the unanimous consensus of the Fathers. They say all the Fathers agreed with us on everything, including the papacy and stuff. Now, I've dove deep into the Fathers, and that's just not true. The vast majority of the Church Fathers do not interpret like the passage about Jesus giving Peter the keys in the Catholic way. They don't interpret Peter as the rock. They interpret like Peter's confession or Christ as the rock. Only a small minority of the Church Fathers actually think Peter is the rock. All of Catholicism stands or falls on the papacy. I think the papacy is honestly the only debate that's worth having about Catholicism. In my video on why I'm not Catholic, which I made several years ago, it was like a 5-minute long video because I said, well, I think the only meaningful argument for or against Catholicism is the papacy. The papacy is the argument on which Catholicism stands or falls. And I'm not convinced of the papacy. I don't see it in Scripture. I don't see it in the Church Fathers. And if you look through church history, you can see the doctrine of the papacy developing over time. You can see the Pope amassing more and more power from the early church to the, post-Nicene era, and then to Vatican I, where he becomes officially declared infallible in certain cases. So I'm not convinced by that at all. I'm not convinced by the unanimous consensus of the Fathers, and eventually I think Catholics started to realize that the Church Fathers don't have a unanimous consensus about all their teachings, and that's why John Henry Newman, the famous Anglican to Catholic convert, really came up with the development of doctrine hypothesis. And I agree with development of doctrine as a Protestant, but Protestants aren't the ones claiming that the Church is infallible, right? So that's why I think that argument is in D tier, but because the reason Catholicism stands or falls in the papacy is because if the papacy is true, then it doesn't matter what you think about any of the other issues. If you acknowledge the papacy is true, you have to submit to the Catholic Church's teaching on everything else. If the papacy is false, all of Catholicism crumbles, and it doesn't matter if they're right about transubstantiation or purgatory or whatever. So I think the most important thing for Catholics to argue for is the papacy in the early church, which I just don't see. There is some concept of the papacy, because the Pope is literally just the Bishop of Rome. And he was given the title Pope pretty early on, but that's a word concept fallacy. Did the Church Fathers mean by Pope what modern Catholics mean? I think it's very clear that they didn't, and I think Eastern Orthodox apologists are very good at demonstrating that. Here's a Protestant life hack. If you're ever worried about Protestantism being true, listen to Eastern Orthodox apologists debunk the papacy, and then listen to Catholic apologists prove the filioque. I think Catholic and Eastern Orthodox apologists sufficiently debunk each other's claims of being the one true church. I think they cancel each other out. All right, next up we have the argument where it's like, oh, Jesus founded my church, Luther founded yours. That's kind of the Catholic equivalent of when Protestants say, like, Catholics worship Mary, or Catholics believe you can earn your salvation. That's sort of like a 1980s Catholic propaganda poster level argument. So that's basically a question-begging fallacy. It's like when people say, oh, why are you in your fake church instead of my true church? It's like you can't respond to that question by saying, yes, I believe in my fake church as opposed to your true church, because that's why it's called question-begging, where the answer to the question is in the question. So when they say Jesus founded my church, Luther founded yours, then you are already presupposing that the Roman Catholic Church is the true church. You're already presupposing that the Roman Catholic Church has unique continuity, and that the Lutheran Church, or if you're Reformed, the Calvinist Church or the Presbyterian Church, does not have that continuity, but that's the exact thing that we're trying to argue. So there's no debate if someone says something like that. It's just like when Protestants say, like, oh, why do you worship Mary and, like, think you can earn your salvation? So it's not an honest argument. It's not intellectually honest. You could argue that the Catholic Church has unique continuity, but simply saying, oh, Jesus founded my church, Luther founded yours, that's not an argument. That's just an assertion, which nobody's going to be convinced by unless they're already Catholic and they already agree with you. All right, so a B tier argument, I think, is the cultural influence of the Catholic Church. I make a lot of videos trying to talk about good things about different denominations, and whenever I bring up the Catholic Church, the best thing I think about the Catholic Church today is their cultural influence. Because they're such a big church, they have a lot of cultural influence. And this is something I think the Catholic Church in the 20th century did a lot better than Protestants. Liberalism came for both the Catholic and Protestant churches in the 20th century. What a lot of the conservative Protestants did is they ran away and became evangelical, and they let the mainline churches get more and more hijacked, and now I have to clean up the mess. But the Catholics stayed loyal to their institution, and because of that, I think the Catholic Church is the last bulwark of, like, conservative values in modern academia, in the modern intellectual world. Evangelicals are not involved in academia because they all retreated and formed garbage Bible colleges, right? But the Catholics are still present in academia. That's why conservative intellectuals like Jordan Peterson always get drawn to Catholicism, because the Catholics are the ones who didn't run away from the cultural conversations the way a lot of the evangelical Protestants did. And the mainline Protestants didn't do that either, but the mainline Protestants got hijacked by leftism, so they're essentially powerless until they get unhijacked, which is what I am working to try and do. But yeah, it is thanks to the Roman Catholic Church that I think a lot of the LGBT movement is starting to die down, thanks to figures like Matt Walsh. And thanks to the Roman Catholic Church, Roe v. Wade got overturned. It was also due to, like, evangelical voters, because in terms of voting, the PCUSA, that's right, not even just Presbyterians, but the PCUSA, the liberal mainline Presbyterian Church, actually votes more conservative than Catholics in America. But in terms of activism, we wouldn't have had Roe v. Wade overturned and abortion go down without the influence of the Catholic Church. So I greatly respect the Catholic Church for that. Okay, so the last argument is arguments about the lives of the saints. Once again, there are so many great Catholic saints. There's Mother Teresa, there's Maximilian Kolbe, there's Bishop Fulton Sheen. Is he a saint? I'm not sure if he's canonized. Either way, I think Bishop Fulton Sheen is a saint. I think he's pretty great. So there are many, many great Catholic saints. But I also know many great Orthodox saints, like St. Paisios. I know many great Presbyterian saints, like Mr. Rogers. The Orthodox priest, Father Stephen DeYoung, says that Mr. Rogers is a Presbyterian saint, and I think he absolutely was. So the fact that the Catholic Church has very holy saints proves that Catholicism is Christianity, which is what I've been trying to tell my evangelical friends for many years. So that doesn't come as a shock to me. But once again, we are trying to prove exclusivity. So guys, that's about it for this video. Let me know if you would rank these arguments differently. And let me know if you want me to do this for other denominations. Let me know if you want me to do arguments for Protestantism, or arguments for Eastern Orthodoxy, or arguments for Oriental Orthodoxy. People don't focus on the arguments for Oriental Orthodoxy, but I think they honestly should, because I think they have some pretty strong arguments, and the only reason people don't consider them is because they're small and they don't have as much of an online presence. But anyway, thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you all later. God bless.